Dan Keller. I'm the police chief here in White Lake. And on behalf of White Lake Township and the White Lake Township Library, I would like to welcome you to the second Civic District Development Study Community Meeting. For those of you who are not here for the first meeting, I'm representing our District Planning Advisory Committee that has been formed between the Township and the Library representatives to study an area of White Lake Township that we are referring to as a potential civic district. It was important for our committee to solicit input from the community in this important process. This evening, we have our second presentation by representatives from the consultant group Inform Studio, who will review the process again and present the first pass of strategic options based on the research and feedback received from the initial community meeting. So please help me in welcoming back Michael Guthrie and Eric Brewster from Inform Studio. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that volume okay? I think last time I kind of blasted some ears. I apologize for that. Need to go grab the clicker here. We appreciate everybody being back again. For those of you who might be a little bit new to this, just kind of walking us through this, I'm just going to have a short introduction, and then Eric's going to go ahead and get into it because there's actually a ton to cover. I think with this too, you'll get the verbal presentation will happen this evening, and then we'll be able to make this presentation available on the city website so that you can go through it at your own leisure, be able to kind of study it a little bit more. And there's also a few boards that are out there for you to be able to look at even tonight. It's just kind of a snippet of what you're seeing in the slide presentation here. But if you happen to have questions about some things that you're seeing, we'll be out there, for a little while afterwards, just to kind of get you familiarized with anything you may have questions with out there. So just to give you a little bit of a feel of where we are in the process. So we started this analysis phase in August. We kind of moved through and had the first community meeting last month on September 13th. We got some great feedback from that. If you recall, we kind of presented here some initial research, some ideas about thinking about the community in general. Put together two ways to participate, really. One, which was a survey, which was more sort of survey questions in terms of aspects of the community and potential desires through a number of different either multiple choice type of things or selected items. And then we also had an analysis where there was the map that people were able to essentially put comments on in various parts of the city. So what we did is we kind of distilled that down this evening. You'll see a very short presentation that tries to give a little bit of an overview of that information. We kind of went back and forth on how much detail to put into that, so we're not going to get into the weeds of that, but you'll essentially see some general overviews of here's what we heard you say. And then in response to that, what we have looked to do and get into this evening is essentially to say, here's some ideas and concepts to start to think about. So when you look at this, and I think that this is probably the most important thing I can hopefully convey this evening, is that we have come up with 3 different strategies for how to look at this idea of a civic or community district. And it's looking at everything from commercial, retail, residential, municipal, how all of these things work together, and would also be integrated in terms of transportation, everything from vehicular, parking, trails, be it bike, walking, all of those types of things, access to amenities, water, all of those types of things integrated. So really looking at kind of a comprehensive plan for this district. And I think that's really critical to kind of see that it's very comprehensive. The other part of it that is important to understand is that we're showing 3 options, but we're not looking for feedback that would necessarily be like, I like option A, or I like option B, or I like option C. How we want everybody to participate and evaluate in this is to be able to look at, hey, I like the way this is working here or there, because what we intend to do is not necessarily pick one of these 3, but to take your very detailed feedback and then integrate that into one sort of cohesive plan. So we're looking at these, and as Eric goes through it, what you'll see is there's strategies of how different areas are handled all within this, so kind of an overlay connectivity. and then specifically where certain programs are allocated. So when we went through and looked at the research, it was essentially saying, hey, here's programs that we're seeing the community would like to see, that there's some development interest in, that makes sense for library, that makes sense for city, and we've located those in different locations, and we've also showed kind of relationships in different locations, as well as the way the whole thing works. So again, it's important to feel free to access, and I think you'll be able to see that in the survey. That's another thing that I meant to mention. But feel free to access that information in a very detailed sense, not necessarily I like A or B or C. And we have kind of names for them too that make it more interesting than A, B, or C. And then Eric will talk a little bit about the idea. We have handouts that are in the back. So essentially we have another survey that you'll be able to essentially comment on all of the information that we're talking about for how to look at the different strategic options for this. So if that makes sense, and you can ask any questions afterwards in the back. Again, we don't want to kind of do an open forum for sake of time and to help people, but again, if you have specific questions individually, we'll be in the back to handle those afterwards. And without further ado, Eric, why don't you go ahead and run through everything. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We're excited to kind of present these three schemes and the results of the work and the input and the research that we've done so far and the community feedback that we've gotten. It's been really excellent, and I think you'll see that in the outcome of these three schemes, the wonderful opportunities that are available for this district. Just to remind everyone, the district that we're looking at is this area in the scheme of White Lake Township. So we're looking at a central area of White Lake Township that can potentially start to serve as a downtown identity point, a walkable community that's within the White Lake Township. Zooming in on the specifics, we are focused the area right at the intersection of M59 and Elizabeth Lake Road. Right now we have the Kroger here and the JCPenney, so those are kind of the landmarks that identify this area that we're looking at specifically. And part of the reason that we looked at this area was the property down here that has been acquired by the library and the township to start to develop a civic campus, looking at a new library building, potentially a new municipal complex, police, fire, etc. And the idea is that development would start to be a catalyst to look at the entire area as a master planning feasibility idea, so that how does this influence the development around it and start to create a more walkable community that could serve as a potential identity for White Lake Township. I want to get into a little bit of the feedback just to kind of summarize some of the important things that we heard from the survey results. This is kind of we entered into this whole project with the idea that, and the kind of notion to look at this as a walkable potential downtown synergistic community that could start to form an identity for White Lake Township. So we wanted to kind of reach out to the community and see your response to that. And it came down to one vote. It was differentiated by one vote. So about half of the people thought it was necessary and would be helpful, and half of the people weren't necessarily on board. I kind of want to frame that in the understanding of the political situation regarding the library. I know there's a little bit of animosity towards the whole process because of what has happened. And I think these results kind of really indicate that a little bit. I think in general, the community would respond more favorably had the situation been a little bit different and the time was a little bit different. But I think you can see even through that, there's at least half of the people are excited about this as an opportunity. And so we're kind of proceeding forward looking at this as an opportunity to be a downtown identity. One of the questions that we looked at specifically was housing in White Lake Township. From our research, most of the housing stock available is single-family detached housing, and the price point for that housing is in the mid to upper range. So one of the things that we wanted to know from the community was how do you feel about the diversity in housing stock? And it was not quite 50-50, but there's a good chunk of people that either don't think that there's enough options for housing out there, or they're not sure that the housing that is there is diverse enough. And then if you look at the home ownership, you see that a majority of people in White Lake Township own. So there's not a lot of options to rent or other housing type of options. And then when people responded to what type of housing they would be interested in and what type of housing they thought could be beneficial, we see that there's a lot of interest in senior housing, single-family housing, and then some of the different varieties of multifamily and more dense housing. One of the things that we wanted to look at when we start to look at a potential downtown area and what kind of services could be made available, we wanted to reach out to the community and see what you thought might be missing and what could be beneficial. And some of the main things that we heard back were medical office. That was our number one response. And then a lot of daycare facilities, care for the elderly, care for the young. So we wanted to make sure that we integrated the availability or the opportunities for these services within any of our plans. And then looking at what the community thought was important within the Civic campus. And obviously the library received a lot of support, so that's well over 50% of people were in support and thought it was important to include that. And then the rest of the functions, the municipal functions that we looked at were about 50%. Less for community center, but there's support for public spaces and police and fire. And then when we wanted to find out what was the most important to the residents of White Lake Township, these were, I don't want to get into the weeds of all these things, but these were some of the things that received the most favorable responses. So we're looking at things like getting in touch with nature, hiking and biking trails, integrating recreation, and then some of the more public space type things like dog parks, picnic shelters, and amphitheaters. That kind of sums up the kind of important things that we took from the responses. There was a lot more information, but those are some of the things that I wanted to make sure that we highlighted so that we kind of understand what framed the way we developed these schemes. The first scheme that I want to talk about tonight is what we're calling the Main Street theme. Just to kind of summarize some of the information, the total site area that we're looking at is about 3.8 million square feet with a built floor area of approximately 1.9 million square feet. That gets us in a floor area ratio of about 0.5. When we talk about floor area ratio, we're looking at the comparison of the built floor area to the available site area. When you're talking about walkable communities, the higher the floor area ratio usually means there's more doors on the street, access to doors are closer, there's less distance in between the doors, and you get a general sense of more walkability. The parking spaces that are provided in this scheme are approximately 3,500, which puts our parking ratio of one space to approximately 530 built square feet. When we look at parking for schemes like this that are looking towards walkability, one of the things we want to look at is right-sizing the parking. When you look at a lot of ordinances are really geared towards making sure that there's never a situation where one spot's not available, which means most of the time there's 50+% of the parking spaces are empty. So when we look at parking ratios, we're looking at something that's a little higher than what you would typically see in the suburban ordinance, because we're looking to create more walkability and really right-size those parking lots so that it really becomes more of a park once district where people come and they park and then they're able to access a lot of different uses and a lot of different features via walkability. when we look at the kind of conceptual framework for our Main Street scheme, really what we focused on was creating a Main Street intersection between what is now the kind of access drive for this development and Elizabeth Lake Road. And when we look at the Main Street scheme, this is our kind of main focus area where we see the primary, most dense development. And then we bring in some smaller, like Main Street fields where you have building close to the street, and they start to really frame that as a walkable Main Street. And you see that in several instances. When you look at the kind of three-dimensional iteration of that, you really see how these buildings and these volumes really start to frame this as a street, where you create a space outdoors along the street with the built volumes that are adjacent. And this really influences people to feel comfortable in these spaces, and these start to actually become public spaces. One of the things we wanted to make sure that we addressed in all of these schemes was connectivity back to the neighborhoods that are adjacent. So when we look at these schemes, we want to make sure that we're able to not just touch these areas and then it's isolated in a silo. We want to create connectivity back to these neighborhoods down here and back to these neighborhoods over here. And so the way we've accomplished these is we've set up walking paths that really start to connect this back into these neighborhoods. We set up multi-use trails that really start to connect and run down the streets and engage these neighborhoods. And then looking at a potential crossing point with a multi-use path that can start to connect this area back to this focal point of development and start to reach across M59. This is the figure ground as it stands today. So you can see there's a few large big box retail developments and then a lot of open available space. What you don't see are the things that I just talked about in that 3D diagram, where you have buildings and building volumes that really start to form spaces for the public. When we bring in our new figure ground, you start to see that these build volumes really define these areas and create spaces instead of those large, vast, open surfaces. This is looking at the existing floor area ratio and the land utilization as it stands today. So right now you're at a floor area ratio in this district of 0.17. And what we've done in the schemes is we've looked to kind of increase these floor area ratios to improve the walkability. And if you look at your land utilization, you see that a big chunk of it is dedicated to surface parking and then stormwater management. What we've looked at in our schemes here is really improving our floor area ratios. So we have about 0.5 in all of these instances. And then when we look at our land utilization, you see that a much larger chunk now is dedicated to open area building and a much smaller chunk is dedicated to surface parking. And that's kind of part of our strategy to increase walkability is reduce these large, vast surface parking lots and really start to bring a more human scale, pedestrian scale into these. You'll see for our stormwater strategy, we've retained the detention basin that's here and looked at using it as more of an amenity as opposed to a fenced off area that gets water occasionally. But really it becomes more of a landscape, water-based amenity that can serve as the public space for the community. Then we looked at taking a more holistic approach to stormwater management for the entire area as opposed to each individual parcel has to deal with stormwater on its own. That way the whole district can come together and really create a more efficient stormwater management system that then can also be leveraged into amenity for the entire district. Because we're looking at addressing the parking situation, we wanted to make sure that if we're trying to frame this as a Park Once district, that when you park here, you are able to get to a lot of things within a simple and accessible walking pedestrian district. So when you look at the available parking and then the 5-minute walking radius, you see that through the distribution of the parking areas, you're able to access the entire site through pedestrian mobility. When we look at parking, you see that these smaller parking areas and these areas really can start to serve as a park once area where then you have access to all of these uses from those lots. Then we also looked at increasing the mobility, the transportation mobility. So we're looking at slowing down and calming traffic and adding pedestrian mobility. So you see we've created a really strong network here of grids that function with sidewalks on both sides, so there's a strong promotion for pedestrian mobility. And then these sidewalks and the proximity and density of these intersections really act to calm traffic, so you're not having vehicles that get up to 35 miles an hour through here. You're really slowing these vehicles down to a 15, 20 mile an hour speed limit through this zone, so that this really becomes a safe and pedestrian-friendly area. Another thing that we've added into the scheme here is these multi-use trails. So these multi-use trails connect back to bike lanes that are instilled upon N59 and creating that strong corridor. There's county plans to kind of really create this bike lane network that is making the entire county accessible via bike. So we're looking to tap into that forthcoming infrastructure and really connect it into this site. So we have these multi-use trails that are developed through this natural area and really become a recreation opportunity as well as transportation infrastructure. And then again, looking at our stormwater systems that we've looked at for this scheme. So for this particular scheme, we've maintained the detention basin here and looked to modify it into amenity. And then this area that we've looked to kind of expand the wetlands that are down here and use this as a stormwater management for the entire area that can then become an amenity for the area. This is a scheme that's consistent with all the schemes. Because of the topography and the floodplains, this area really becomes difficult for building in. So to maximize the efficiencies of the site, we can really leverage this as a stormwater management amenity. Now, looking at we're briefly going to go through the programming here. This is at a zoomed out scale, so I want to touch on just a couple of things, and then we'll zoom in and get a more kind of refined look at the programming that we're proposing. Like I mentioned before, we're looking at bike lanes that kind of connect this corridor along Highland Road, and then connecting those to multi-use trails that really connect the entire site and connect the entire district as a whole. One of the things that we looked at is utilizing this high ground area as a potential spot for an interpretive nature center. So really it becomes immersed in this natural environment that exists through here and allows us to create a connection point here to the rest of the district, and then start to access the waterfront with a boardwalk that could be utilized for fishing and observing the waterfront. And when we look at the programming in a more zoomed in scale, you'll see that we've brought the height up with mixed use programming right at this intersection to really define this as the kind of main intersection and the defining point for the main street scheme. We've also, we brought in a lot of our municipal functions into this area. So we have fire, police, and the township hall offices and over here. We've put the library over here and the site that it's designated for right now with its kind of existing setup for the parking lot. And then we brought in some retail functionality through here, some more mixed use to kind of define this corridor, and then looking at a couple of different housing options. So for this scheme, we looked at specifically a senior housing, like an aging in place kind of independent living senior housing active community where you have these townhouse type setups that are very nicely located adjacent to mixed use, where there's restaurant and retail opportunities available to serve these residents. And we brought in a couple retail opportunities and mixed use live-work opportunities as well along this avenue here. So those are, we're looking at small scale retail office type things where you could have maybe a chiropractor's office or a small doctor's office or things like that, where you really create the scale that's appropriate for this area, for those type of functions. And then looking at a housing development in this area. So this is, for this scheme, we're looking at more of a apartment building type housing where you have several larger buildings that create this network and get you a higher density of units. And then just kind of getting a feel for the overall development. Like I said, we've maintained this detention area, but really made it more of an amenity. So you have these walks, this almost like a boardwalk type setup all the way around this wetland area that then serves as an amenity in a public space for this. And we brought in some green park type spaces, and we really organized these central kind of front entrance areas as these green, almost like park type entrances. And then we've made these little public spaces that exist in between our developments here. And I also want to, in this scheme, we've set this area up for athletic fields. And then all along this area where we have this existing kind of natural environment, we really emphasize that and brought the trail along that to define that edge where we have our development, and then we interact with that natural environment and make it as an amenity for the entire district. Moving on to our next scheme, the scheme we're calling the Spine Scheme. And just to get into the information a little bit, again, about 3.8 million square feet site area. This one is a much denser development strategy. We're looking at almost 3 million square feet of built floor area for a floor area ratio of around 0.77. A little over 3,000 parking spaces are provided in this scheme for a parking ratio of 1 space per 950 square feet. So this is probably on the most ambitious end of what's feasible for a Park 1 district as far as parking goes. So in this scheme, we've really emphasized that the parking is not as important as creating these pedestrian-friendly corridors and spines. Looking at the kind of conceptual framework for how we developed this scheme, we dedicated this spine as a pedestrian-only connector spine. So this is layered as a public pedestrian space that also has built-in infrastructure. So we've layered this kind of public space over top of this infrastructure function to really maximize the potential of both of those. And then we've set up these avenues that kind of filter all of the action towards this spine as our central organizing principle. And then when we look at the 3D, you can see how really we've reinforced that spine with our built volumes, and then carved through these spaces to really filter all of that traffic in towards that spine area as our central organizer and connector. Again, similar strategies to make sure that we've connected this to our neighborhoods. And again, you see the kind of same strategy where we've used built volume to really start to define those spaces. Our floor area ratios, as you can see, are much higher for this. So within this kind of main zone, we were able to achieve a floor area ratio of 1. So that's kind of the standard when you look at walkability. 1 is usually your goal for your floor area ratio, because that means that you have an equal floor area ratio to lot volume, and that really starts to maximize your potential for walkability. These other areas we've gotten closer as well with the kind of density of the housing in this area, and then this area is more dedicated to some of our surface parking, and then a lot of more open areas, so our floor area ratio is much smaller in this scheme. But again, you see that the land utilization for parking is much, much lower in this scheme than even our previous scheme, and especially much lower than when we look at what we have existing. Similar, just showing that, you know, we've provided these parking lots strategically in order to make sure that we have access to the entire site through your kind of allowable walkable area. And then you can see that we've really allocated all of our vehicular traffic to the outside and dedicated this central area to pedestrian access. So this becomes a pedestrian spine that really organizes this entire framework and starts to connect everything back to our transportation network. Again, we've set up a multi-use trail that then follows kind of the contours of this natural edge and starts to work its way back and connect to the rest of the community. The stormwater management for this scheme, like I said, we layered this pedestrian access and this public space over our stormwater infrastructure. So we brought in stormwater management areas that are, again, focused on being amenities. So these are attractive and they become strong public spaces. And then they feed back into this, you know, expanded wetland area that becomes an amenity as well, but really starts to serve the entire area. Same as the other one, I just want to touch on a few things before we zoom in. Our boardwalk strategy here along the water's edge is a little smaller, where it really just becomes a path network that allows people to access that water's edge, but there's not necessarily a lot of space provided there. And then connecting again back to a nature center at this high point in this natural area, and traversing that topography and connecting back to this central kind of dense developed area. Again, we've looked at the bike lane opportunities to kind of tie into that county network system, and then connecting that back through and getting a broader connectivity to the rest of the district. As we zoom in, you see this scheme, we've brought in a lot of retail. So this pedestrian area really focuses on retail to really serve this as a pedestrian walkable friendly area where you have a lot of doors along this pedestrian corridor. So you're stopping multiple times and getting a lot of access to retail here. We brought in, again, some mixed use functionality and then some live work type residential in this scheme. So again, this scheme looks at using a smaller scale retail office type programming on the street level with then residential opportunities above. And this acts as a buffer transition from this strictly single family residential area. We have mixed use again along the kind of this main kind of intersection. And then looking at senior housing opportunities. So working with this kind of long-term assisted living care facility here and providing more opportunities for independent senior active living. For this scheme, we looked at the community center in this location to really tie into the strong intersection, and then bringing the library here so that we've really framed these really nice public spaces that serve the community center and can serve the library as well. So these public spaces are then framed that can feed into this large public space along the natural edge where you have wetland and forest opportunities here. We've looked at the fire station and police station up here in this scheme, and that is kind of in response to some of the survey responses that weren't necessarily super excited about having sirens go off all the time while your library is over here. And also looking at accessibility to Highland Road as a very strong kind of vehicular connector. So looking at coming out here and then having connection to a very broad swath of the community in a very short time frame. And also separating it from a lot of our kind of residential type areas over here. For this scheme, we looked at the township offices in this location. They can start to work with this kind of natural edge and really create a nice environment that then can spill into some of these public areas. For this particular scheme, our housing development that we've looked at in this area looks to respond to a what is called the missing middle housing format. So most developed areas usually do okay at single-family housing and usually do okay at your higher density apartment buildings, but there's that missing middle housing where you're talking about quads and duplexes. So that's a strategy that we looked at for this particular area, was introducing some quads and some duplexes into this housing development. And then again, your nature center here on this high point and then feeding back into your boardwalk. You can see from kind of the character of the scheme that you get a lot of very strong public space down this pedestrian spine. So these little wetland areas really serve as amenities for all this kind of public space as it filters down into your wetland area and then back into the entirety of the wetland system. You can also see in this scheme where we have a higher floor area ratio that there's a lot less area dedicated to surface parking. So we have your surface parking lots here, but then there's a lot of public space that is provided in these areas. Then looking again at some of the programming specifics, you have your live work units, your library in this area with this public space like we talked about. And then connecting back to a lot of these public spaces along this route. The last scheme that we're going to present tonight, we're calling the pocket scheme. Just some information on the scheme. Again, we're about 3.8 million square feet of site area with about 2.6 million square feet of built area. So our floor area ratio for this is 0.68, so a little less than our previous scheme, but still getting closer to that 0.1 goal. In this scheme, we've provided about 3,100 parking spaces for a ratio of 1 to a little over 800. So again, this is towards the higher end of what you look at for a rule of thumb for park-dense districts. So we acknowledge that we're ambitious in this, and these numbers will probably be refined as we finalize our scheme. The conceptual framework for the pocket scheme was really based around creating small pockets of public space that can start to form a network throughout the district. So you're traversing small distances to get to these active public spaces that can really start to create a stronger sense of public life in this district. And when you look at that in 3D, again, you see that these building volumes really start to form these spaces that can then serve as playgrounds, can serve as outdoor gathering spaces, can start to serve as splash parks, etc. And they are then all networked together to create this really dense system of connected active public spaces. Again, making sure that we're connecting everything back to the adjacent neighborhoods so that the development doesn't become a silo. And then you can see, especially in the figure ground, these little pockets that are created with our built volumes. Again, our floor area ratios, so this particular scheme, we're not as dense for our housing development over here, but again, we get pretty close to our 0.1 goal in this main kind of development district, and you'll see that a much smaller portion of our overall land utilization is dedicated specifically to parking. Again, making sure that our Park One strategy provides connectivity to all the areas that we're trying to serve with our strategic location of these parking areas. And then if you look at, again, our transportation, we've created a really dense network of these transportation areas that really work to, one, calm traffic and provide connectivity so that anyone who parks over here would then have a very connected route back to any of these programming spaces over here. Stormwater strategy for this scheme. Again, we don't actually provide any surface stormwater management outside of our kind of centrally located stormwater management for this scheme. Potential opportunities for stormwater management in this can be underground, under the parking, which is a fairly common strategy for stormwater management, is temporary storage that then filters back into your central stormwater management. So those are options to then get back to this, again, main stormwater amenity. Looking at some of the zoomed out programming thing, again, we've kept those bike lanes here to kind of connect to that county infrastructure. We've looked at a dog park here and really kind of maximizing our opportunities for public spaces. Again, we have a much more ambitious boardwalk scheme for this particular scheme, where we look at expanding the boardwalk to kind of come out into the water a little bit and provide swimming areas then, so that this becomes a recreation opportunity that connects back into this development. Again, we have our nature center on this high point, tying back into this connected system, and then extending our trails back to connect to the rest of the district. When you look at this scheme, again, we have a lot of mixed use along this street, and that's really to provide a lot of impact at the street level with retail, and then provide opportunities for potential office or residential above in these areas. For this particular scheme, we've looked at senior housing as a couple different forms, right adjacent to this long-term care, where you have more of a multi-unit type, almost like apartment building type framework, and then more of like a townhouse type framework. And then that feeds into more, not necessarily senior living, but again, more housing opportunities that fit into kind of that townhouse or that's kind of like multi-unit condo typology. The housing for this scheme is more of a single-family detached unit. So again, it's a little denser than kind of the spread out housing that's here, but it's a similar scale to this housing as far as this floor area, and then provides a very strong kind of pedestrian feel along the street. For this particular scheme, we've added some retail opportunities at the corner here, right at Elizabeth Lake Road and 9. Some infill retail here to really reinforce this intersection. And then looking at more of our kind of municipal uses, we've brought the township offices into this corner to really define this edge. The community center here, so that they can really utilize a lot of this potential retail that goes into these mixed use areas. We've looked at the library in this location to really maximize the visibility right at this intersection and capitalize on a lot of the opportunities for these public spaces, as well as adjacencies to potential retail opportunities for coffee shops, etc. We've looked at daycare opportunities, both adult daycare and child daycare here, with the public space behind that could potentially be used for a playground and create some intergenerational opportunities here. Capping it all off with some mixed use, and then defining this edge with some condo type, townhouse type housing to really define this edge and start to create views back into this natural area. Looking at the character of this scheme, you can see there's a lot of public spaces that are provided with the green and the paved surface, or the hard surfaces. And these really create opportunities for a lot of public spaces. For this particular scheme, you don't see a lot of surface parking, and that is because we've tucked the parking underneath a pedestrian deck. Because of the topography along this edge, we're able to treat these almost as like a walkout basement, but for parking. So there's access into the parking from these lower levels that are then open air, but this street level provides public spaces. Again, you see this large area of green that can be dedicated for a dog park, and then this natural edge that really starts to define that interaction. Looking at some of the programming for the public spaces, so we've looked at a playground in this area adjacent to the library, and a lot of the residential opportunities. Again, we mentioned the playground that could go in here, and then a lot of park opportunities for these areas, outdoor gathering spaces that could potentially have outdoor fireplaces, benches, seating, etc. We looked at potentially a splash pad in this area that really can connect back to the community center and the township offices here. And then the housing for this scheme, again, more of that single family, but focused more on an active pedestrian street. Again, I talked a lot about the stormwater management as a potential amenity. So when we look at the stormwater amenities, this is kind of the form that you're looking at, where you have these public spaces that, again, are directly adjacent to these systems that provide a lot of potential for wildflowers and natural grasses, and really serve as infrastructure, but act to create a very strong, beautiful public space. And then even more ambitious when you get into those lower areas where you look at potential boardwalk paths that go through the stormwater system with opportunities to kind of really engage with nature, and then potential sculptures or other types of public engagement opportunities. That concludes the presentation of the 3 different schemes. Like Mike said, we're looking for feedback that's really going to be focused on the aspects of each scheme that you thought worked really well, or the concerns that you had with each scheme, so that we can respond to those individual items and really synthesize one scheme that capitalizes on the best parts of each individual scheme. What we're going to provide is a online survey very similar to the survey that was taken during the analysis phase. That link will be made available tomorrow at the end of the day. On our flyers that we've provided in the back that can be picked up on the tables as we exit, that link is available there. So end of day tomorrow we'll have that up, and we'll have a lot of the graphic information that you've seen this night, tonight during the presentation, to kind of respond to some of those things and speak to the elements that you thought were the most successful or gave you the most concern. That concludes my end of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Mike so he can kind of wrap it up, and then we'll meet up outside and we can kind of talk and answer any questions.
Great job, Eric. We appreciate that. And I just wanted to reiterate maybe a couple of things. When you see this, we recognize that the plans are fairly ambitious, right? That this is a fair amount of square footage, a lot of buildings, a lot of infrastructure. The idea behind this is we're looking at 20, 25-year type plans, possibly longer. So in the sort of phasing of things, this isn't something like, okay, we anticipate it looking like this in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So it's important to understand that. What we're trying to show today is, okay, here's a projection for the future in terms of a goal to work towards. As you start to give commentary and feedback in terms of what direction to go to, we come back and we kind of distill that into one plan, but then we also will phase it in the next piece to start to look at, okay, here's what it looks like maybe 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And again, it's guidelines, it's a way that at least you have a plan or a sense of here's a focused purpose of where the whole community can kind of get behind as you look at development of areas. So it's really to be able to say, hey, something doesn't just show up down the block and, you know, surprise, but you have a, hey, cohesively and understanding of a community, here's where we really want to see these things go, and these are the priorities and the things that we see are as important. So we hope that this has been helpful to start to galvanize this idea of a direction to go to, and again, make sure you pick up a pamphlet on the way out that will have that survey link that you can take it. It's not up quite yet, so as Eric said, that it should be up by the end of the day tomorrow. So get the link but plan on being able to look at it by end of day tomorrow. You'll be able to, the sooner you communicate, the better. So we're going to have this be a very organic process where we're going to have to kind of sit for a period of a week before we look to, move any further on. But we can start to gather that input over the current week, but it'll be open all the way until the next period. So it gives us an opportunity to refer to it over time, but we would love to have as much participation as soon as possible. And again, one more thing just to kind of sum up, the presentation that you saw here, we will make available on the city website so that you can get it and review it and see it in a little bit more detail on your own. So that will be available. I know that this is being, I think, telecast online live, so if it's been difficult to see things at all, that will be available again on the city website. We should be able to make it available tomorrow. So I would say check by end of day tomorrow just so that they have an opportunity to get it and then upload it to the site. And so with that, we're going to conclude the presentation. Thank you so much for coming, for those of you who are tuning in, and we look forward to talking to you if you have any questions outside in the foyer there. So thank you very much for coming.